sector. Where I come from, the understanding is that the preoccupations of such preoccupations are the work of government. The public sector ought to be dealing with this. Now, for this alliance, do you hear this argument with a certain level of scepticism, or?
Well, can I first clarify? I wear two hats in this sort of situation. One is the one you introduced me with, which is Aquafed, but the other is that I'm the spokesperson very often for business and industry in these discussions of the wider business and industry. And one of the things that I noted in both keynote speeches was the words implementation and action. And that's what business is about. It's about doing things on behalf of communities in one shape or form. And that is often cast in a slightly contentious framework for water, but it shouldn't be. Business is part of the community, not apart from the community.
But didn't I hear that water was invisible underground? So, I mean, the businessman wants to see instant returns and profit margins, and
I think
does it represent a case in point?
I would say that's a false representation of business. Sustainable business, which is what I'm interested in, is getting the equation right between service delivery or product delivery on the one hand and profitability on the other hand. And I have two hands, and I have to walk in balance, which means that my two hands have to be extended the same distance left and right. So I don't subscribe to this business of businesses only to make a profit. Profit is vital for a business's life, whether it's a public business or a private business. So let's keep the things in focus. Let's concentrate on what we need to do, and that is long-term sustainability in business, which is balancing the two extremes.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to go a bit more global with institutions that have the sort of global preoccupation. Mrs. Kakabat, so let's start with you. Responses, please, to what you've heard.
Thank you. My first reaction is that water is the backbone of everything, of life and everything that happens, and that the risk of water in general is a risk on security of humanity. No water, no life. That's the simple equation. And we see that very often we tend to address water as an isolated resource when we have to give it in not only an interpretation, but do work based more on ecosystems. Water within land, water within forests, water as rivers, water as lake, water as a resource for urban sites. Otherwise, isolating it makes us lose the importance of looking at water more as an integrated landscape resource.
If I may come in there, this idea that we're not seeing this in the same way, because if we have sort of divisions of class, if you will, the idea is that if somebody's taking a shower now, and they stay for about 10 to 15 minutes in a shower, and they see it as their privilege to be able to use lots of water. It's not the same preoccupation as somebody who's living in the Sahara, for example, for whom a glass of water is much more precious. So you're saying that we all have to see the universality of water, but some people have more than others. So how are you going to change that mindset? In the world constituency, because I'm still looking at this world. I'm not saying Ecuador, the world. Are we going to think as one?
One of the big problems of today is that we look at water only within our immediate system, our immediate lives. We are not seeing water as something that is a global resource and exactly. A global need.
And how are we going to do this?
We need to educate ourselves in thinking that whatever I consume or damage or affect or keep and guard for my immediate need is affecting positively or negatively someone else in other parts of the world. And that goes from agriculture to the climate change, the threats. When we look at, for example, the depletion of the glaciers around the world, who's responsible? It's us all. It isn't just the Ecuadorian or the Peruvian or someone in the Himalaya. It is a global problem for everyone, and not only for the most vulnerable peoples, as the examples of the minister. Cameron, last January, a year ago, with the floods in the south of the UK, said climate change is a security issue. And he was talking about lots of land and towns underwater or flooded. So it's happening in the UK, it is happening in Malaysia, it is happening everywhere, Germany or Ecuador. The most important message, I think, is we have to look at it as a global problem. The poor are more affected, the most vulnerable are more affected, but we are all going to suffer from it.
Thank you. Monsieur Jarreau, UN water. Responses to the keynote speech.
Well, I would like indeed to structure my response along the three issues you have raised, Melanie. And water, everyone agrees, is everywhere. Water is interacting with everything, and that's what makes the challenge very difficult. That's why it's so important to have one single goal on water, because the usage of water are sometimes very much in conflict with each other. So the governance, by definition, has to deal with a hugely complex matrix management. This is what we have been trying to deal at the intergovernmental level, the UN, through the setting up of UN Water. A number of countries have done similar things, actually including the countries around this panel. But many countries have not done it yet. So it's very important that, with respect to the governance, this cross-cutting aspect is also reflected at the national level, but also at the subnational level, cities, regions, and sometimes basin-level management of water. On the second issue, the financing, actually, a lot of work has been done already under the umbrella of UN Water on the cost-benefit of investing in water, but mostly for the two pillars of the MDG, water and sanitation, not so much on the other aspects. And the SDG on water will go much beyond that. So it's very important that we also develop some instruments and proper analysis how to justify the benefit of investment. And as you said, the benefit of investment is not only a short-term benefit. Sometimes to invest now for a benefit which may be in 30, in 40, 50 years. So it is important that we invest more in this linkage between these sort of water issues and the economic side. The third point you mentioned, Minister, was with respect to the delta issue, and that's interesting because it also connects to the two concrete examples you gave, which is a good illustration of the connection between the water issue, the climate change, and the disaster. Three of the key issues which we are dealing with this year. Actually, the reason why I would like to maybe go a little bit further than you went on that one is that when it comes to climate change impact on water issue, what it is important to take into account is the fact that the past is no longer a good indicator for the future. When it comes to water investment, the traditional approach was to say, let's look at return periods of 100 years, 200 years, 500-year period, and see what was happening, and let's protect ourselves against these extreme events. This is no longer valid because of climate change. A good example is what happened in Philippines. You know Cyclone Haiyan, you remember Typhoon Haiyan. Philippines is the place in the world where the sea level rise has been the biggest for a number of reasons, which I could explain, but largely due to climate change, about 35 centimeters over the last 50 years. Now, it's likely to continue at that rate. So what is important when rebuilding is not to take into account the past, but to also rebuild better, taking the future into account. So you need to link all these fields together. And that's why there's not a single solution, a single size shoe working for all. We need really to look at it from a holistic manner. I'll stop here. I know you're keeping an eye on your watch.
Thank you very much. Minister Van Hagen, I'd like you, now that you're part of a conversation, I'd like you to respond to the responses to your keynote speech.
It's quite a difficult task with these different opinions, but I hear some things. First of all, I'm not worried about universality, as you asked, because I think this is a problem for Western countries as much as for other countries. The example was, for example, England, but also New York after the Sandy storm, for example, or New Orleans in 2007. So you can see that we are all facing the same challenges. I'm a bit more worried about the story, and what I learned from the panel is that we just not only should introduce people or faces, but also make the link with climate change, disasters, broader disasters, and not only discuss the past, but also the future. So I think that's an important thing to learn from my colleague panel. And I'm also worried about implementation, of course. This is one of the most difficult things to do. We are discussing during the World Water Forum with a lot of people, a lot of possibilities, but really doing it, we need businesses, we need governments.
Minister, I'll just come back on the idea that you've helped me a great deal, because that word implementation, if we can keep it in our minds, we want to flag it as a very separate issue to take it in some depth.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So this implementation, we will discuss this deeper, I think, but is very, very important. Just doing, and what I learned that maybe can help us is Donald started with it from the Nile Basin, the stakeholder involvement, and I believe that Mr. Giraud or Yolanda was also discussing this discussion on or the involvement of the regional level, of the city level, because one of the questions I asked is how can we convince political leaders to invest? Well, we can also do it on a different path by involving stakeholders, by involving cities, by involving regional levels. And because of that, political leaders have to act because the pressure will be bigger. And we had this project in the Netherlands giving the rivers more space, broadening them, letting them meander again because it would be safer. This was first of all, a technical project. We wanted to lower the water level. But we started involving everybody living near to the river. And beautiful projects started to came from this project. 39 projects all along our rivers. And the people really wanted it. At first they were against it because we were going to give land back to water. But now they all wanted it because they were also involved. They were also possible to create their own ambitions. And this gave a lot of pressure on the national political level. And that's why in the end the parliament said, yeah, now we want it too. And at first they didn't want to. So creating this involvement of stakeholders may be one of the keys to get politicians to invest in future projects instead of only looking at the short period.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering from the panel at large whether there are any other responses to what you've heard from somebody else. I mean, I've given please, Mr. Moss.
Yeah, I'd like to reinforce what Michel Jarraud said. If we look at the history of the MDGs, we see, as he rightly said, it's focused very much on taps and toilets, yes, and caused the larger water cycle to be forgotten. The SDG discussion, to me, is bringing water back to where it should be, the big cycle, from water flowing from resources to the various different uses, agriculture and all the rest of it, and then flowing back from those uses, and this is the bit I want to stress, we call the blind side of the water cycle, where the pollution comes back to the resources, and we have to manage that pollution. Now, the SDG proposed deals with both protecting the water resources and dealing with the pollution problem, putting water and sanitation and equality and other things in the centre. And I think that's extremely important. We need to keep it in focus.
Mrs. Kakabatsi.
I wonder whether it is too ambitious to think that water has to be a cross-cutting issue for the SDGs. It affects development, it affects health, it affects food production, it affects energy, it affects growth and urban settlements. There is absolutely no goal that doesn't depend on water. I was part of the debate of the MDGs some years ago, and I was terribly upset to see that environment was totally isolated from the rest of the MDGs. And we can see the results today, after all these years, that environment was dealt as if it was protected areas and species, when it should be something that is rooted into every single need and activity of society. So in building the SDGs, my fear is having it isolated in very specific activities or needs when it should be much broader than that.
Thank you. Again, something that we'll return to. Minister, if you would. Yes, please.
Yes. I still want to put the emphasis on a people-centered kind of an approach on the SDGs, and not just generalize. And from where I'm seated, the human face for water and sanitation can be best represented through the face of a woman. And I think it is that, if we really want to have a targeted approach, that we put the face of the woman and the plight of a woman as our main intention in terms of restoring dignity, promotion of equality, because of the time that women spend in many of the underdeveloped countries to go and fetch water, how they become victims of rape and perpetual abuse because they have to walk the same road, the same path every day to go and relieve themselves. So I'm saying, let's deal with that. And if it is about action, action must be targeted to a person. And for me, that's one of the things, including children. The youth must be, because if we're saying water, our future, many of us here are almost the disappearing species. We need to get young people to become part of the water movement.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for 2 more interventions from my panel. And having promised participation, I must deliver participation, because then after this, we're all on our own. We don't know what's going to come from the... But please, who did I see first? Mr. Che? Mr. Che.
Yeah, I like to bring in one other issue, kind of the issue from the keynote speech. Melanie just introduced 2 different cases of the disaster from the beginning. So that means it is necessary to focus for the importance of the reality in terms of the in water. Sometimes, Yolanda, told us, sometimes many people think about water is just isolate the resource, but is it going to be related? It is necessary to have integrate the water resource management as well as linked with the other factors. So to find out a good solution, it is necessary to understand the reality of the water. The reality of the water's situation is going to be different side to side, country to countries. So that means some solution from the Western countries is not going to be well adapted for the Asian countries. It's not going to be well adapted to African countries. So that's why it is necessary to understand for reality. So that's why I wanted to have some focus about that.
Thank you. I think actually all our panelists have one last word before we go to the floor. Monsieur Jarreau.
Yeah.
And then we'll have Donald and then back to Minister.
Thank you, Moderator. I wanted to come back to this issue of water cross-cutting. Yes, water is cross-cutting for sure. But having an SDG on water doesn't mean it's isolated. Actually, it's quite the opposite. It's exactly the opposite. If it was, if we were to have sort of scattered goals on water, we would not contribute to solve the problem, we would make the problem worse. Why? Because the application of water are often in conflict with each other. Let me take one very, very simple example, and I apologize for those who have heard me already using this example. I've used it on many occasions. If you take a dam, you may use the water of the dam for producing electricity. That's the link with energy. You may use it to help minimize the damage of floods. You may use it for irrigation, for example. Now, these uses are very much in conflict with each other. So the only way to deal with water, if we don't want to exacerbate the tension, is to deal with it in a holistic manner.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kazandi?
I think we have listened to where we have come from with the MDGs and this transition to the SDGs. I think my feeling is that at this moment, our departure point should be about building resilient communities, because all these extremes we are hearing about, either no water or too much water, I think we really need to start thinking about building resilient communities.
Thank you. Minister?
I very much agree with what Michel just said about the importance of having a goal on water and the holistic approach. I think that's extremely important, and also what Jack said about the fact that water, we need to work with that approach, as you said. So I very much agree with that, and thank you so much for mentioning women and girls and the link to gender. For me, also personally, that is an extremely important angle also to put on this. And I agree with you that the face of this challenge should be a woman's face. We know the time that women spent on getting water, the challenges with violence and sexual abuse is extreme. So I think that angle is extremely important, and that's why we need an SDG on water, but we also need to integrate with cross-cutting with the other SDGs. And I think that's the strength of the SDGs compared to the MDGs, that is exactly what we are doing now. And when it comes to implementation, I know that there's a debate about the number of targets and the number of indicators, but I think for me the most important thing is not the number, but the content, and that we have the right indicators, which will make it happen in reality afterwards, and that will push us as politicians to deliver on what we promise.
Thank you very much. By a show of hands, are we boring? Are we boring you? Are you happy? Please put your hand up if you're sort of happy with this conversation. Ah, wonderful. I'm running for president. Okay. I met a gentleman yesterday called Fred Van Zyl at a cocktail party. And as Karen prepares for our Twitter, I'm going to pick on you. I'm sorry, I'm always picking on people. This is the trouble with being a school teacher all my life. Fred, please ask a question so as to save my bacon.
All right, this is to the panel. I'm from South Africa, and my minister's sitting there, but in South Africa, we do this not because of the SDGs. We are obliged to do this. We are committed to do water and sanitation. We did it 6 years prior to the MDG. We initiated it. That's a human right. We are all involved. We've got a water security issue. We are obliged to do this. And I want to support you on your question you ask. Must it be the SDGs and then we do it? Or do it because we are obliged to do this? And why are we just doing it because the SDGs? Why don't we do it because it's a forum, it's an action, and then get that political support to centralize water and make it important in terms of the world? But Israel, do we have the right to attack here?
Thank you. I hear the word political support. So I'm going to pick on the three politicians to respond. Why aren't you supporting it? I'm sure that's a mean question. But to respond, where are we going to get the political support to make SDGs the number one priority?
Oh, I understood his question different. He said, why wait for SDGs? Just act. And the sense of urgency differs, of course, in different countries. For us, for the Netherlands, we are not able to survive if we don't invest in water security, because a big part of our country is 4 or 5 meters below sea level. So not investing will be the end of our country very soon. But for not for all countries, this is the same. If you look at the United States, they have different kinds of disasters. So after Sandy, after the flooding of New York, they are now investing in water security. But before that, they were investing in totally different things. So how to get it on the political agenda? Again, what I said before is to involve stakeholders and let them give pressure on the political leaders to act not only on the short in the short time of their appointment, but for the future also. And I think this is very important to do.
Minister?
Well, I must say, yes, you could wish for things just to happen by themselves and that things were just better than they are. But the fact is that we need a regulatory framework to give us a direction on where to go as a global community. So I believe strongly in the importance of having this regulatory framework on a global basis with the universal goals. I don't think these things will just happen by themselves. I think we do need to have that common focus and have a goal and targets and indicators and a monitoring process and implementation. And you can think this is boring and difficult and slow, but I believe that's what we need to make sure that we are going in the same direction and that we can establish our partnerships on the basis of a common goal. So I strongly believe that the water crisis is also a crisis of governance. I agree that governance is not the same as government, and that we need to make sure that we together, public and private sector, civil society, work together to achieve the goals that we set. But I believe it's important to have the regulatory framework.
Minister?
We are one of the few countries that have just been emancipated from inequality and racism, and I think our success can actually be measured as one of the best practices in the world. The fact that water rights are enshrined in the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa is also a great thing to learn as a best practice. Secondly, that within a period of 20 years, political will actually came from the first time we attained our democracy. So for us, it's no longer about political will. It is about the capacity. It is about long-term planning. It is about dealing with inequalities, because water can contribute towards unifying the country. Water can contribute towards dealing with inequalities. Water can actually assist us in making sure that we become part of the world. But we also need the world to contribute towards this cause that we have led on our own. And hence then the issues around global participation and partnerships.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm coming back out into the audience to ask you if you want to make additional comments or questions. Before I do that, though, I want to remind for those on the live stream that the hashtag for the Twitter feed is HLPSDG. I was going to say, even for those of you in the audience, if you're extremely shy, you could tweet in your question, but I encourage you to go ahead and ask it. So if you can show me any of those in the audience, I mean, there's been a lot discussed here. There's a lot coming in on Twitter, but I do want to give for those sitting in the room here to start with some comments and questions. for our panel here. And if you could be so kind and introduce yourself before you make your intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, moderators. My name is Tele. I'm the advisor to the Minister, Mukonyani, from South Africa.
Sorry, can we just query the sound system from the technical folk? I can't hear, so maybe I'm odd. It's on, though.